Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would be looking into the reasons why Wordsworth make a break with the neoclassical tradition. Wordsworth makes a break with the neoclassical tradition by giving an account of the process of poetic creation. He departs from the neoclassics, who are largely concerned with poetic genres, rules and regulations, and reason and logic. Wordsworth points out that no attempt was made by the neoclassics to formulate a theory of poetry, and Wordsworth is credited to have taken the first step in this direction. Romanticism has been defined as liberalism in literature, and Wordsworth advocates this liberalism when he upholds the need for the independence of the poet. The poet is a man who is satisfied with his own passions and expressions. The poet's personal feelings give him the strength to support his cause. The individualism of the poet is therefore highly significant. The poet is endowed with a greater enthusiasm than the common man. This enthusiasm forms the base of the romantic critical theories. Wordsworth is a romantic in his disapproval of the poetic diction of the neoclassic school. He has cleared the way for experimentation in style and diction. He appeals to his readers to judge the poem themselves and trust their own feelings without being carried away by the judgment of others. This is because competent critics of poetry are rare. Truly, the preface occupies a commendable position in the transitional phase of the history of literary criticism. This said, let us now move on to find out the affinities of the preface with neoclassicism. M.H. Abrams, in The Mirror and the Lamp, points out to the close affinities of the preface with the neoclassical thought. According to him, at many places in the preface, Wordsworth has used neoclassical terminology. His technical vocabulary in many places sounds similar to the neoclassics. For instance, Wordsworth uses neoclassic jargon when he says that poetry is the image of man and nature. His phraseology is closely akin to that of Dr. Johnson and other critics who belong to the neoclassical school. Wordsworth's appeal to traditional authority is similar to the neoclassic dictum. His reference to Aristotle to justify his claim that poetry is the most philosophical of all writing is an example. Similarly, he justifies the use of meter because its rules are fixed and its use is traditional. Wordsworth is very close to the neoclassical position in his insistence of the generality and universality of poetry. The truth of science is personal and particular, while that of poetry is universal and general. Poetry studies the universal laws of human nature, which are permanent and which have been the same in all ages. Wordsworth's likeness with the 18th century is also reflected in the moral function that he assigns to poetry, which he reiterates. He once wrote to his friend that every great poet is a teacher. All these resemblances with 18th century thought could be considered insignificant and superficial, for they cannot deny the creativity of Wordsworth as the pioneer of romantic criticism. In various ways, he creates fresh pastures and makes crucial pronouncements which were to direct the course of the history of English literature and criticism. Let us now observe Wordsworth's theory of language. Wordsworth's theory of poetic language is a reaction against the neoclassical theory of poetic diction. This view is partially true because the primary purpose of Wordsworth's theory of language was to find a suitable language to treat a different kind of poetry. His aim was to deal with the humble life of the rustics, and it's quite natural that he should advocate simplicity of language to suit the simplicity of themes in his poems. His dictum that, I quote Wordsworth, "the poet is essentially a man speaking to men," unquote, justifies his call for a language used by the ordinary man. Wordsworth believes that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. The poet could communicate best in the language which is really used by men, and the superficialities of language invented by Pope and his followers are a masquerade of tricks, quaintness, hieroglyphics and enigmas. This is what Wordsworth said. Wordsworth claims that his poetry would deal with humble and rustic life, and so it is appropriate that he should use the language of the men of the countryside who are to be the subjects of his poetry. The language of these men has to be purified of all that is vulgar in that language. Wordsworth's intention is to use a selection of language of real men, because the aim of the poet is to give pleasure. The language of the rustics, used without selection, would cause disgust, because only the judicious selection of the language can give pleasure. The use of simple language is advantageous because it is unpretentious, emotional and passionate. This is a case when these humble people are in a state of emotional excitement which is charged with the emotions of the human heart and are expressed without any reservations and inhibitions resulting from social vanity. Such a language would be natural language of passions, which operates from the heart and thus progresses directly to the heart. In the use of such a language, the essential truths about human life and nature can be effortlessly and clearly communicated. It is a more philosophical language inasmuch as its use can result in a better and clearer understanding of the basic truths. Since the rustics are in communication with the beauty and grandeur of nature every hour, the best part of their language is derived from such communication, and so it is noble, poetic and capable of giving the highest poetic pleasure. The language of poetry must not be separated from the language of men in real life. Artificial poetic diction, as practiced in the 18th century, must be evaded. In a state of emotional excitement, men would naturally use metaphorical language to express themselves forcefully. The earliest poet used only metaphors and images that resulted naturally from powerful emotions. Later on, poets used figurative language, which was not the result of genuine passion. They merely imitated the manner of the earlier poets, and thus arose the artificial language and diction of the neoclassics. A poet must avoid artificial diction when he speaks in his own person or when he speaks through his characters. However, his language should vary according to the nature, rank and status, thought and emotions of the character who speaks it. Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction is of immense value when it is considered alongside the neoclassic use of poetic diction. However, there are a number of contradictions and limitations. Wordsworth does not state what he means by language, which is a matter of vocabulary and syntax, imagery and the figures of speech. Let us now look into one of the important precepts known as the theory of imagination. C. M. Baura, the well-known critic, in The Romantic Imagination, notes that the Romantics attached great importance to imagination and took special view of it. Wordsworth's preface is primarily concerned with observation, and the word imagination occurs only twice. In order to understand his view on imagination, the poems and letters of Wordsworth have to be analyzed. In the preface, the word imagination occurs first when Wordsworth tells us that his purpose has been to select incidents and situations from humble and common life and make them look uncommon and unusual by throwing over them a color of imagination. This makes it clear that imagination is a transforming and transfiguring power which presents the usual in an unusual light. The imagination is creative, says Wordsworth. It is a shaping or plastic power. The poet is half the creator. He is not a mere mechanical reproducer of outward reality, but a specially gifted individual who, like God, is a creator or maker as he adds something to nature and reality. It is the imagination of the poet which imparts to nature the glory and freshness of a dream, the light that was never on land and sea. Wordsworth argues against the observations of Hartley and the other associationist psychologists who had taught that the human mind receives impressions from the external world, which are therein associated together to form images. The mind merely reflects the external world, but according to Wordsworth, the mind does not merely reflect passively, it actively creates, so it is half the creator. Imagination is the active and creative faculty of the mind, says Wordsworth. It is through imagination that the poet realizes his relationship with the eternal. Imagination works upon the raw material of sense impression to illustrate the working of eternal truth. It is this power which makes a poet perceive the essential unity of man, God, and nature, while the intellect of the scientist merely multiplies the diversities. Wordsworth mentions that the poet is a man who has thought long and deeply, and so he can perceive of things which are absent as if they are present. The poet contemplates in tranquility the emotions which he experienced in the past and can visualize the objects that have given rise to these emotions initially. Thus, imagination becomes a visualizing power which enables the poet to recreate the past. Imagination is the mind's eye through which the poet sees into the heart of things as well as into the past, the remote, and the unknown. It is imagination which enables the poet to render emotional experiences which he had not personally experienced as if they were personally felt emotions. It is the power of imagination which enables the poet to universalize the particular and the personal. It is through this power that the poet arrives at the universal truth. Stressing the importance which Wordsworth attached to the role of imagination in the process of poetic creation, C.M. Bowra noticed that Wordsworth regarded imagination to be the most important gift that the poet could ever own. Wordsworth calls imagination to be, I quote, reason in her most exalted mood, unquote. It is a higher reason and that faculty which transforms sense perception and makes the poet conscious of human immortality. It makes him have the visions of the divine. Wordsworth deals with imagination at greater length in his preface to the 1815 edition of the Lyrical Ballads. He draws the distinction between fancy and imagination. According to Wordsworth, fancy and imagination have the power to evoke and combine, aggregate and associate. However, the material which they evoke and combine is different, and their purpose in evoking and combining is also not the same. They differ not in their nature, but in their purpose and in the material on which they work. The material on which fancy works is not inclined to change as the material on which imagination works. Fancy makes things exact and definite, but imagination leaves everything vague and indefinite. Let us now move on to Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, which is of immense significance. As I had mentioned in the previous lectures, Coleridge was the first critic of Wordsworth who actually tried to find out what was the fault in Wordsworth's theory of language. Of course, it was not the fault of Wordsworth, but it was a fact that Coleridge could not agree to some of the dictates of what Wordsworth had mentioned. Coleridge is the first critic to expose the inherent weaknesses of Wordsworth's theory of language. He points out, firstly, that language so selected and purified, as Wordsworth mentions, would differ in no way from the language of any other men of common sense. After such a selection, there would be no difference between the rustic language and the language used by men in other walks of life. Secondly, Wordsworth permits the use of meter, and this implies a particular order and arrangement of words. If meter is to be used, the order of words in poetry is bound to differ from prose, which does vary in the poetry of Wordsworth. The use of meter indicates the whole atmosphere and the language of poetry, which is bound to differ from that of prose. Coleridge concludes that there is and there must be an essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Thirdly, the use of meter is as artificial as the use of poetic diction, and if one is allowed, it is absurd to prohibit the use of the other. Both are equally good sources of poetic pleasure. Coming to the fourth point, Coleridge objects to the use of the word real. He writes, I quote, "Every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activity of his faculties, and the depth or quickness of his feelings. Every man's language has firstly its individualities, secondly the common properties of the class to which he belongs, and thirdly words and phrases of universal sense. For real, therefore, we must substitute ordinary or lingua communis." Unquote. Fifthly, Coleridge points out the erroneous notion that the best part of human language is derived from nature. The best words are abstract nouns and concepts that are derived from the reflective acts of the mind, and reflection grows as man advances from the so-called primitive state. When man has advanced in thought, he acquires new ideas and concepts which cannot be expressed through the use of rustic language, which is primitive and undeveloped. If the poet desires to use rustic language, he must also reflect like the rustics. Coleridge mentions, I quote, "The language of rustics is curiously inexpressive. It would be putting the clock back. Instead of progression, it would be retrogression." Unquote. Wordsworth does not adhere to his theory in his own practice. Inverted and poetic constructions are frequent in his poetry, and often his vocabulary is not drawn from rustic life. He does not use the language of real men at all times. Wordsworth's theory of language has intense weaknesses, but its significance is far-reaching. Let us now recapitulate what we have done so far. Romantic poetry, according to Wordsworth, is not imitation, but an act of self-reflection. Wordsworth gives importance to imagination and regards imagination to be more worthy than reason. Wordsworth appears to be advocating the neoclassical stance with regard to generality and universality of poetry. The preface is probably the most valuable document in the history of English criticism. It helps to bring about a divergent perspective regarding poetry and theory that Wordsworth most sought after. It gives indispensable insights into the nature, scope and function of poetry and to the creative process. In order to understand this module better, we have questions for you that you can read, you can find out the answers and understand more about what Wordsworth wanted to bring about in his preface. We have several questions for you that would enable you to understand the module better. Until we meet next time, thank you.